Sophia pressed her back against the kitchen wall, hands trembling as she listened to Mr. James shout in the next room. Whether she likes it or not, she will marry that man. His voice was loud and firm, and Sophia's heart pounded so hard that she feared they might hear it. She had never felt so afraid or confused in her life. She held her breath, hoping that they would not realize she was only a few steps away, hearing every word that would change her future forever. Mrs. Monica's tone was calm but cold when she replied, "We cannot keep her in this house any longer, James. She is 21 now, and we have our own family to think about." Sophia's legs felt weak. She remembered the days when she first arrived at their home. She was only 7 when her parents died in a terrible car accident. Mr. James, her father's younger brother, took her in. Back then, his wife, Mrs. Monica, was kind and warm. They could not have children at that time, so they treated Sophia like the daughter they never had. She felt safe and loved, even though she missed her real parents. But everything changed when Mrs. Monica got pregnant years later and gave birth to a baby girl they named Jane. Jane became the center of their world. Sophia understood that a new baby needed a lot of attention, but she did not expect the love that her uncle and aunt once gave her to disappear. She tried to stay helpful, cooking meals and cleaning to make things easier for them. She thought if she worked hard enough, they would still show her some care. But day after day, Mrs. Monica and Mr. James acted like she was nothing more than a maid. She cooked, scrubbed, and lived like a shadow in her own home. Now, she was standing in the kitchen, staring at the tiled floor. The conversation in the living room turned to quiet whispers, but she had already heard enough. They wanted her gone. They wanted her to marry a man she barely knew. This was how they planned to get rid of her. Sophia took a shaky breath and tried to gather her courage. She picked up a steaming pot of soup and walked into the dining room, forcing a small smile onto her face. She set the pot on the table, and Mrs. Monica nodded without even looking at her eyes. Mr. James cleared his throat, casting a sideways glance at Sophia. "We have made a decision," he said, his voice low but firm. "There is a man named Michael. He is looking for a wife. We have agreed that you will marry him next week." Sophia's heart skipped a beat. She let out a tiny gasp and turned to face her uncle, her eyes wide with disbelief. "Uncle James, I do not want to get married yet. I wanted to go to university. You promised I could continue my studies after secondary school." Her voice trembled, but she tried hard not to cry. Mrs. Monica let out a short laugh, then spoke with a tone that felt like ice on Sophia's skin. "That was before, when we thought we could manage your expenses. But times have changed. We have Jane to raise, and spending money on you makes no sense. You are a burden now." Sophia opened her mouth, but Mr. James cut her off with a wave of his hand. "You have no right to say anything else. The decision is final." She felt tears welling up, so she bit her lip to stop them from rolling down. She asked in a soft voice, When is this man coming?" 2 days from now," Mr. James said, his spoon clattering against his bowl. "He will come to meet you, and then we will arrange the wedding." That night, Sophia lay awake on her thin mattress. She felt like she was in a nightmare. She had always believed her uncle and aunt might change their minds about her education. Even though they had stopped showing her love, she hoped there was a small spark of kindness left. But now, she knew they were determined to send her away. The next afternoon, Sophia was kneeling on the floor, scrubbing the edge of the kitchen sink, when the front door opened. She heard Mr. James speaking to someone in a friendly voice. "Come in, Michael, come in. Please have a seat." Sophia dried her hands on her skirt and walked into the living room. Standing beside Mr. James was a man in his early 30s. He wore plain trousers and an old shirt. His shoes looked worn, as if he had traveled by foot for a long distance. He seemed quiet, holding a small bag that looked like it contained a few books. He had a gentle smile, though his eyes seemed guarded. Mr. James introduced them. "Sophia, meet Michael. He works at our local library as a bookkeeper. Michael bowed his head slightly. Nice to meet you, Sophia. She swallowed hard, her lips trembling. Good afternoon, she managed to say, bowing her head too. She felt strange that she was meeting a complete stranger who was supposed to become her husband in a matter of days. She wanted to run away, but she had nowhere to go. She worried about finding food and shelter. She was stuck. That evening, they agreed on the wedding date. It would happen the following week. It was not a grand celebration. Only a few family members came. No close friends were invited. The event was quick, and Sophia tried to stay strong. She felt a small knot of hope that maybe this man would be kind to her. But she also felt bitter that her life had been taken out of her hands. After the short ceremony, Sophia moved into Michael's small apartment. The place had just 2 rooms, a sitting room and a bedroom. The furniture was old, and the paint on the walls was faded. A tiny kitchen sat by the corner, with a single window that let in weak sunlight. Sophia put down the small bag that held her clothes, feeling tears rise again. She wiped them away before Michael noticed. Michael tried to make her feel comfortable. He pointed at the worn couch. You can rest if you are tired, he said softly. I know this place is not very big, but I will do my best to make you feel at home. Sophia nodded, forcing a polite smile. She felt confusion swirling inside her. When she looked at Michael's calm face, she sensed warmth and genuine care. For a moment, she forgot that she was forced to marry him. She wondered why a man who seemed so gentle had agreed to this strange arrangement. She also wondered if this was a trick. All her life, she had been disappointed whenever she dared to trust someone's kindness. In the days that followed, Michael left each morning for his job at the local library. He told Sophia she could relax at home while he was gone. You do not have to worry about money, he explained one day before leaving. I will handle our needs. This surprised Sophia. She had expected him to push her to look for work or demand she clean every corner of the apartment. That was how Mr. James and Mrs. Monica had treated her after all. But Michael was different. He would come home with groceries, prepare dinner with her, and ask about her day in a gentle tone. At first, Sophia kept her guard up. She had been hurt so many times that she found it hard to trust. She thanked him politely, but she rarely smiled. She would notice him studying her face sometimes, like he wanted to say something, but he often kept quiet. One evening, about 2 weeks after the wedding, Sophia noticed that Michael's phone rang often. He would step outside to answer the calls, speaking in hushed tones. She caught fragments of words like client, deal, and funds. At first, she thought he might be looking for extra jobs or perhaps dealing with money troubles. Her curiosity grew when she saw him receive a visitor wearing an expensive-looking suit. The visitor addressed Michael with respect, calling him Sir Michael. Sophia felt her mind spin. Why would anyone address a library bookkeeper with such a title? Later that night, she confronted him carefully. Michael, she began, her voice quiet. I have noticed you get many calls lately, and some people speak to you in a strange way. Is there something you are not telling me? Michael set down the book he was reading and looked up, his expression nervous for a moment. He forced a smile and said, They are old friends from my past. Nothing to worry about. Sophia nodded, but she felt a flicker of doubt. She had noticed that he dressed well when he left for those meetings. He would return home looking relieved yet cautious. Something felt hidden. One afternoon, Sophia decided to follow him. She felt guilty, but she could not shake the feeling that Michael's life was not as simple as he claimed. She waited until he left for his usual library shift, then slipped out of the apartment a few minutes later, covering her head with a light scarf so she would not stand out. She stayed a good distance behind him, afraid he might notice, but it seemed he was too focused on wherever he was going. Michael stopped outside a tall building made of glass and steel. 2 security guards stood at the entrance. The way they greeted him made Sophia's heart race. They bowed their heads, calling him sir. Michael walked in, his shoulders held high. Sophia followed quietly, feeling nervous. The guards did not stop her, maybe because she slipped in behind a group of people. Inside, the floors were polished, and the rooms looked very expensive. Men and women dressed in formal clothes walked around with laptops and files. Sophia hid behind a large pillar, peering at Michael from a distance. He walked into a spacious conference room with a long table. Through the glass door, she could see people in suits shaking his hand. Some looked like investors from other countries, while others looked like top managers. Michael sat at the head of the table. Sophia's breath caught in her throat. She suddenly understood that Michael was not just an ordinary bookkeeper. He was someone important, likely the owner or a major leader of this company. Her eyes searched the big room. All those serious-looking people seemed to respect him and listen carefully when he spoke. She felt dizzy with shock. She did not know whether to walk in or wait. Her legs shook with fear that Michael would be angry if he found out she had followed him. But her curiosity was too strong. She pushed open the glass door softly, stepping into the room. No one noticed at first, because they were all focused on Michael's words. Suddenly, Michael glanced up and saw her standing there. He went silent, his eyes wide. The people around the table looked at her in confusion. Michael raised his hand, and in a calm but firm voice he said, "Can you all give me a moment? I need to speak with my wife." The group nodded politely, some smiling as they stood to leave, taking their documents with them. Soon, the two of them were alone in the large meeting room, the city's noise muffled by thick windows. Sophia stepped forward, her heart thumping in her chest. "Michael, who are you?" He let out a long sigh and ran his hand over his face, looking tired and a little guilty. "I wanted to tell you when the time was right," he began, his voice shaky. "My full name is Michael Anderson. I own this company. I started from nothing, but over the years I built a network of businesses and now I have a large investment group. I have always kept a low profile in our neighborhood. I wanted to live a simple life." Sophia stared, not sure if she was dreaming. "But the library job?" Michael gave a small smile. "I really do work there sometimes, but not for the salary. I volunteer as a bookkeeper because I love books and I want to help young people in the community. Most of my business is handled by my managers, but I like to stay involved, so I have these meetings." She took another step closer, tears shining in her eyes. "Why did you hide it from me?" His face softened, and he looked down at the polished floor. "I have seen many people pretend to love me only for my money. My relatives arranged many possible matches, and each woman seemed more interested in my bank account than in who I was as a person. I wanted a genuine bond. When Mr. James approached me, saying he had a niece who needed a husband, I decided to meet you. I could tell you were a kind person, but you did not want this marriage. Still, I saw your gentle nature the first time we spoke, and I hoped that maybe you could accept me for who I am, not what I own." Sophia felt her throat tighten. She remembered how cold her uncle and aunt were when they gave her away. She remembered how Michael had been kind from day one, never demanding or shouting. Despite her fears, she had begun to see him as a gentle soul. And now, she realized he was a man of great wealth who chose to live humbly. She searched his eyes, trying to understand if there was any deception left. Then she asked quietly, "What do we do now?" "We are already married. Did you marry me only to test me?" Michael shook his head quickly. "No, not exactly. I knew you were in a difficult situation. When I learned from Mr. James how they wanted to send you away, it broke my heart. I had gone there initially just to see if it was true that they were so desperate to marry you off. But the moment I spoke with you, I sensed your strength behind your shy smile. I admired you. I wanted to save you from that toxic environment. I felt it would be better for you to live with me than to remain in that house." He paused, eyes shining with concern. "But I should have been honest. I am sorry." Sophia gazed at him, feeling a strange mix of anger and relief. She knew she had been forced, but she also saw the care in his eyes. Slowly, she walked toward the wide window that overlooked the city below. Cars, people, and the rooftops of other tall buildings stretched out before her. She took a moment to breathe, her hand resting on the cool glass. She turned back to Michael, tears rolling down her cheeks. "I forgive you, but I need time to understand all of this." He nodded, stepping closer. "I will give you all the time you need." They returned home in silence that evening. Sophia stayed in the bedroom alone for a while, her mind racing. She thought of Mr. James and Mrs. Monica, and how they had thrown her away like garbage. Yet their decision led her to a man who actually cared about her. She also thought about her dream of going to university. The idea of continuing her education suddenly did not seem impossible anymore. The next day, she woke up early to find Michael preparing breakfast. He was flipping pancakes in an old pan. He handed her a plate, looking a bit shy. "I know there is a lot we have to talk about," he said gently, "and I want you to know that I will support your dreams. If you want to go to university, let us make that happen." Sophia's eyes filled with tears again, but this time it was from a sense of joy and relief. She set the plate down and hugged him, her face pressed against his shoulder. She felt safe for the first time in years. Michael wrapped his arms around her, and they stood there in the small kitchen, finding comfort in the warmth of their embrace. Over the following weeks, Sophia began filling out applications for university. Michael introduced her to some of his staff and managers, and she discovered a whole new world of possibilities. She was surprised by how down-to-earth he was even at work. His employees loved him, not because he was rich, but because he treated everyone with respect. She also discovered that he had a quiet desire to help others, especially young people who had no support, just like she once had none. As word spread that Michael's wife was now visiting his company, a few of Mr. James's relatives heard. Soon, Mr. James and Mrs. Monica learned the truth. They had married Sophia off to a man who turned out to be a very wealthy businessman. The news nearly made Mrs. Monica drop her phone in shock. They had never bothered to look deeper into Michael's life. They simply saw his simple clothes and assumed he was poor. A few days later, Sophia and Michael were having a light conversation in their living room when the doorbell rang. Sophia opened the door and froze. Standing there, looking uncomfortable, were Mr. James, Mrs. Monica, and Jane, who was now a bright and chatty teenager. Mr. James cleared his throat. "Sophia, we came to see you." Sophia stood aside to let them in, her mind filled with memories of how they treated her. She looked over her shoulder at Michael, who stood up, folding away the newspaper he had been reading. Mrs. Monica forced a warm smile that did not reach her eyes. "Sophia, we have missed you," she said. "We wanted to see how you are doing. We also wanted to say we are sorry for how things happened." Jane played with the hem of her shirt, looking around the small apartment. "Wow," she said quietly. "I never thought you lived here, Sister Sophia." Sophia's chest tightened at the word sister. Jane had never really called her that in a sincere way before. She wondered if Jane's innocence was genuine or if she was just following her parents. Mr. James looked at Michael. "Michael, please forgive us if we offended you. We did not know you were well off. We were only trying to secure a future for Sophia. We hope you will understand." Michael's face was calm, but his eyes were serious. "Understand what, exactly?" "That you forced her to marry me without caring about her feelings," he asked softly. Mr. James stuttered. We thought it was best for her. We did not want her to waste time." Mrs. Monica rushed forward. "Look, Sophia, we need your help. The truth is, we are in some financial trouble. Your uncle's job is not secure. We heard that Michael has a large business, and we were hoping maybe you could talk to him to help us out." Silence filled the room. Sophia felt her hands begin to shake. Memories flashed in her mind. Nights when she cried herself to sleep, days when she was yelled at or ignored, weeks of her life wasted because they refused to send her to university. Now they wanted help. Michael stepped closer to Sophia. She saw the sympathy in his eyes. She knew he would do anything she asked. If she wanted to help them, he would. But her mind replayed the image of how they had thrown her away. She took a deep breath and turned to face her uncle and aunt. She tried to keep her voice steady. You only came to me when you realized the man you called poor is actually rich. You never cared if I went hungry. You never cared about my education. And you even arranged for me to marry someone I did not know. Mrs. Monica's cheeks flushed and she lowered her gaze. Mr. James opened his mouth to speak, but Sophia cut him off. You did not invite my friends or anyone I cared about to the wedding. You sold me off without a second thought. And now you stand here asking for help because you discovered that I am married to a wealthy man. Do you think I have forgotten how you treated me? Mr. James's eyes filled with tears. Sophia, we are family. Please have mercy, she shook her head. The only family I had was taken from me when my parents died. You cared for me at first, but you changed when your own child came. I owe you nothing. I have a life now, and I plan to live it without the pain you caused me. Mrs. Monica tried to speak, but the words stuck in her throat. For a long moment, they stood in awkward silence, broken only by the sound of Jane quietly sniffling. Perhaps the young girl felt ashamed of how her parents had treated Sophia. Michael placed a reassuring hand on Sophia's shoulder. She took one final look at the people who had once been her only family. Then, in a calm voice, she said, I think it's best if you leave now. Mr. James and Mrs. Monica, faces downcast, realized there was no more room for pleading. They left with slow steps, and Jane followed them, turning once to glance back at Sophia, a look of regret in her young eyes. When they were gone, Sophia collapsed onto the couch, tears streaming down her face. Michael sat next to her, pulling her into a gentle hug. She sobbed against his chest, letting out all the pain that had built up inside her for so many years. When her crying eased, she looked up at him. I feel guilty for turning them away, she whispered, but I cannot pretend their actions did not hurt me. Michael brushed a tear from her cheek. You have the right to protect yourself from further harm. I will support whatever you decide to do. Over the next few weeks, Sophia continued her university application process. Michael gave her space whenever she needed to be alone with her thoughts. Sometimes she remembered her uncle's desperate face, and she felt a tug in her chest. But she also recalled the sting of being treated like a maid, the memory of being sent away to a stranger to ease their burden. She understood that trust could be damaged beyond repair. One day, Michael came home with an envelope in his hand. These are your admission papers, he said softly. You got accepted. Sophia trembled with excitement. She opened the envelope and saw the acceptance letter. She jumped up, forgetting all the heartbreak, and hugged Michael so tightly that she almost knocked him over. Laughter and tears mixed in her voice. I cannot believe this is happening, she said over and over. Michael held her close, smiling. I always believed in you. Not long after, Sophia began her studies. She found a new purpose, diving into her books and learning about the world in a way she had never been allowed before. Michael, busy with his business, always made sure to check on her progress, encouraging her every step of the way. One evening, they strolled through a local market, holding hands. Sophia saw children running around, some shouting happily. She spotted a little girl who reminded her of herself many years ago, an orphan, perhaps, looking for kindness. Tears stung her eyes as she remembered her own difficult past. Michael noticed and gently squeezed her hand. Maybe one day, he said softly, we can help more children who do not have anyone to care for them. There are so many who need love. Sophia's heart warmed at his words. She thought about how her life had turned out so differently from what she once feared. She remembered standing in Mr. James's living room, terrified about marrying a stranger. Now, she realized that what seemed like a curse had become a blessing. She had found a man who respected her and opened doors she never knew existed. Walking side by side, they shared stories and dreams. Michael spoke about building libraries in small towns and offering scholarships to students who could not afford tuition. Sophia mentioned starting a shelter for children who lost their parents and had no one to look after them. They laughed together, imagining a better future. She felt a sense of peace settle in her heart. While she would never forget the pain her uncle and aunt had caused, she knew she could use her past as a reminder to care for those who were lonely. She was no longer trapped in a home where she was unwanted. She was free to decide her life and fill it with empathy. Later that night, as they returned to their apartment, Sophia paused at the door. She turned to Michael with a grateful smile. "Thank you for saving me," she whispered. He touched her cheek, gazing at her with affection. "Thank you for believing in me," he said. "I promise you will never regret it." Sophia unlocked the door, stepping inside. The small apartment was still the same, with its old furniture and simple decor. But it felt different now. It felt like home, a place where she was wanted and where she could dream without fear. The light in the corridor flickered, and she set her books on the small table, then turned to Michael with a playful grin. "Tomorrow I have classes," she said. "Will you come home early enough so we can study together in the evening?" Michael chuckled. "Of course. I am a little busy, but I will make the time. I do not want to miss a single moment with you." And so their life continued with hope. Sophia still had moments when she remembered everything she went through: her parents' death, her uncle's change of heart, the forced marriage. But now she had a new perspective. She saw how even the darkest moments could lead to unexpected happiness. She saw how one man's quiet kindness could heal wounds that seemed impossible to mend. She did not know what the future held in detail, but she knew she was no longer alone. With Michael by her side, she felt prepared to face anything. Day by day, she rebuilt her confidence, and in time, she began to trust in her own strength. She started to reach out to others who might need help, just as she once did. And in the days and years ahead, she would always look back on that afternoon when, trembling behind the kitchen wall, she heard her uncle's words about marrying her off. She would remember the terror and hopelessness she felt. But she would also remember that, out of that frightening moment, she found a new path, one that taught her that love does not come from wealth or family ties alone. Love can come from the simplest acts of kindness and the quiet vow of someone who truly cares. She would carry that lesson with her forever, a reminder that the worst moments in life might sometimes guide us to places we never dared to imagine. And in her heart, she would remain thankful, despite all the pain, that she found a chance to be free and to love someone who loved her for who she truly was.